All right. Welcome, everyone. Happy pre-kend. We are a quarter of the way through the semester, believe it or not. So let's start off the way we always start. Does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns before we get going? Cool. So today we're back to discussing Emily Oster's book. Some apologies that this was a really long chapter. So in our discussion, I think we'll probably stick mostly to the alcohol stuff, but if you guys want to get into coffee and smoking, we can do that as well. So who wants to start by summarizing what we read last night? Peyton.
Results and how those studies differ from the recommendations that maybe the doctor may recommend. And she comes up with her own kind of at each of the topics she comes up with the base like her recommendations that she found herself and kind of just use that to the interpretation of how to choose for yourself and see how to use data based on that and decide whether you want to extra cup of coffee or not have like that drink. But then she also says that overall recommendations to stop with certain people.
Right, excellent point. So for those who didn't hear what Peyton said, this is more like what this book will be moving forward. We'll pick a topic that's sort of important to pregnancy. We'll talk about how, conventional recommendations, what your friends say, what Facebook says, might differ from official recommendations, but also how there's differences within official recommendations. So what Emily Oster does is go through the data, go through the scientific studies, sum up if there is a consensus, and Peyton, you used the word recommendation. Let's sort of back off of that because what she says is what she's not set out to do is recommend to you, but put the information out there so you can make a choice on your own. Sita, you had a hand up earlier. Did you want to add anything to that?
She also talks a lot about why the research evidence or results are so differing. And like randomized trials and observational data, and also how like the moral/ethical standpoint of like if you were to do a controlled study that would require you to force pregnant women into it, which is like not okay.
Right, thank you for sharing that. And we'll be talking about the ethics of some of these studies later in the class, but you bring up a really good point because what I like in particular about this chapter is I think it's a really good tying together point. And what I mean by that is we start this semester learning some basic things about data, how science works. We did data visualization. Next week we're doing bias. And from there, we'll start to switch gears and talk really more about the philosophy behind causality, right? How can we tell causes and effects? So with that in mind, what do you guys think of this chapter? What are your opinions? Yeah, Lily P.
I thought it was really interesting. I think alcohol. She mentioned at some point that a lot of the misconceptions and the kind of outcomes through America is that a lot of her friends who she knew thought that alcohol was kind of good straight to the baby. So their argument was like, you wouldn't give a baby alcohol or give a fetus alcohol. That's not how that biologically works. And it just reminded me of a lot of misconceptions about the new mRNA vaccines and how people are like, it all comes with DNA, but it's just not that much.
Right, exactly. So for those who didn't hear Lily and for the people listening to the recording at home, one of the things that was really interesting about this, how much should we drink during a pregnancy is the fact that when we're making decisions in a data-driven world, one of the things we have to understand, and we'll talk about this a little later in class, is not just the data, but also the mechanisms behind the data. So you raise a really good example of fetuses don't necessarily absorb alcohol right away. The alcohol that you drink gets filtered through your GI tract, through your liver, and eventually into your bloodstream, and it's through the blood that it makes its way through the placenta and then to the fetus. So by the time it gets to the baby, it might have already been filtered out, which also raises another interesting point when it comes to making decisions with data, right? How it's not just these variables that we know we're talking about. So, for example, on Wednesday when we were looking at graphs, how we saw graphs with, say, drinks over time. I might have 5 drinks at once, I might have 3 drinks at once. Over the course of the day, I might have 6 drinks, whatever. It's not just these variables that jump out at us, but there are also some hidden variables that we're concerned with, like how quickly we're drinking. So it's not just 5 drinks in a day, but if you have 5 drinks in a day and space it out over, 24 hours divided by 5, so let's say 1 drink every 5 hours, that's very different than 5 drinks in 1 hour. What about the rest of you? What did you guys think about this chapter? Yeah, and remind me of your name? I didn't hear you, I'm sorry. Yeah, so one of these things this chapter does is provide a lot of information. And that can be a little off-putting at first, it's one of our longer chapters, but it can also be very, very valuable. What about the rest of you? What do you guys think? Yeah, and you're so masked up I can't see who you are, I'm sorry. Okay?
It's kind of, for me, it's kind of overwhelming because I'm someone who because it's unethical to test pregnant women, obviously, alcohol versus no alcohol. It's kind of hard to really find what is the exact amount that you should or should not be drinking. Just saying up to a drink or 2 drinks, it's not specific enough for me. So if I was pregnant, I think it would be kind of one of the things that I would try not to push because I think too careful about, but for me, what is it really going to affect versus someone else?
Right, so Lily T brings up 2 really interesting points, I think. One is that there's just so much information. And 2 is the point we were making earlier where it's not just the information, but what you do with it. And we really have to respect agency at the end of the day. It's not just saying you should do this or you shouldn't do that, but given this information, what is the right decision for you? Anyone else? What did the rest of you think about this chapter? Yeah, Ray Ray.
Doctors say don't drink alcohol, don't smoke, because it is very individual, and the study kind of they didn't want to put that responsibility on the parent, so they kind of make the decision for them, which I thought was very interesting.
All right, so let's run with that a little bit. This concept of making the decision for other people, especially something like making the decision for pregnant women. What do you guys think about that? Because on the one hand, it can make a lot of information, like Lily T said, much easier to digest. It's much easier if there's just a blanket recommendation, don't drink. But on the other hand, like Ray Ray's saying, it sort of takes away your ability to make those choices for yourself. So what do you guys think about that? Yeah, Sita and then Peyton.
I definitely think that there are both good and bad things to both sides of that, because if you're someone like Emily Oster, for her it was well, I want to know why, and also I want to drink coffee. And then maybe for another pregnant person, having decisions made for them would be great and make it a lot less stressful. But I think that there's probably a happy between of being given options, and if you want to know why those options are there, there's research behind it, or their thoughts on the matter, so that it's not as not so much a dump of information that you have to sort out, but maybe channeled information.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. Peyton. Sorry.
I thought she brought up the point about, again, pregnant women kind of feel like they're being treated like babies. So when she brought that point in, especially with the misconception that women they're being told what to do, so she brought that point back up about how she kind of felt like a child again with the drama.
Right, and it's really sort of ironic that when you are pregnant, when you are, about to have a child of your own, that you're getting treated like a child. Christina? Cynthia, I'm so sorry. I promise I'm usually pretty good about learning names during a semester. It's so much harder in masks and in an auditorium where it's kind of dark. I'm so sorry. Cynthia, please.
One of the things that I was thinking about this now was you get a choice with any other like and they'll present us with the option and they'll say what they recommend because it's the safest or whatnot. But ultimately it's up to the patient to decide which way they want to go, whether it's financial or anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So it strikes me about that some parts of the medical field gives you that choice. Pregnancy doesn't.
Right. Anyone else? An excellent point. For those who didn't hear, it's sort of strange that this seems sort of inconsistent with the rest of the way medicine acts for us. Do you want to undertake this procedure? Do you want Advil or Tylenol? Usually we're presented with some level of choice, but here we're not really. And to the extent we are, it's not so much a choice as a conflict, right? One of the things that really struck out to me in this chapter was not just the, lack of information behind the recommendations, but that so-called official recommendations are conflicting with one another. What the Mayo Clinic says might not be what the American Association of Pediatrics says, might not be what, what to expect when you're expecting says, might not be what someone else says. Before we even get into the stuff like mommy wars and getting yelled at on Facebook and all the, information and misinformation on the internet, these so-called official recommendations are conflicting with one another as well. And that's just within the country. And then when we go to places like Europe or Asia, we see even different sorts of recommendations. So you're right that there's this sort of absence of choice. But to the extent a choice exists, it's a conflicting choice rather than, an A or B style choice. What about the rest of you? What do you guys think? Yeah, and remind me of your name. Mm-hmm.
And how for her it's actually better to get at least drink a little bit of coffee because her body is so used to it that it's going to put more stress on her and the baby if she stops completely. Whereas everyone's like, oh, you can't drink coffee, you can't drink coffee. But she's probably got the worst pregnancy she didn't have anything.
Yeah, excellent point. And that sort of brings me to one of the other things I want to talk about today, right? So Emily Oster wakes up, she learns she's pregnant, and right away that comes with a whole list of do's or don'ts, right? What are some of the do's and don'ts you guys have heard about that maybe we'll talk about this semester? Just shout them out. Don't drink. Don't smoke, right? Those are two in this chapter. What other do's and don'ts of pregnancy have you guys heard? Eat healthy, whatever that might mean, right? Talk to the baby, play classical music. What else? Exercises that might be recommended, like prenatal yoga. Exercises that might not be recommended. I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah, over here, Julia, and then on the side.
Don't travel too late into your pregnancy.
Right. Things about airline restrictions even before COVID. And remind me of your name?
Lee. Don't forget to get your husband's permission if you want to change something about the pregnancy.
Okay. So, excellent point. And let's say partner rather than husband. What else? What other do's and don'ts have you guys heard? Raw foods like sushi. We've also seen stuff like lunch meat, so cured foods. Yeah, Lee.
Okay, that may come off as if I agree with that. I was making fun of the fact that was like.
Yeah, no, I understand. I was just saying.
I swear I don't believe with that.
You're right.
Women should be able to control their own bodies.
Right, and one of the things we talk about in this class is respect for agency. I wasn't trying to call you out or put you on blast. I apologize. Anyone else? Do's or don'ts? There's some good things. Annika mentioned stuff like prenatal yoga. We might also say prenatal vitamins. What are any do's you've heard? Take prenatal vitamins. Right? So here's the thing. You wake up, you're pregnant. I'm using the very general you. And let me take this opportunity to remind you, I would be teaching this class the same way at Hampton-Sydney. This is a class about decisions in a data-driven world. This happens to be an area where there are a lot of decisions we have to make and a lot of data behind those decisions that may or may not be hidden. So you wake up, there's immediately this list of stuff you should be doing and stuff that's off limits. And like we saw earlier, what you should be doing and what's off limits sort of conflicts with one another, not only in terms of what people are saying on the internet, what your doctor is saying, what your friend's doctor is saying, but these official recommendations. These disagreements, and this is really, really striking, don't just occur in popular talk, in casual conversation. They occur in official recommendations. So first of all, what's the difference between these two? What's the difference between what your doctor says and what your friend says and what Facebook says and what the Mayo Clinic says? Yeah, Annika.
Some are based on research, some are based on like personal beliefs or morals, and some people just want to like heard and pulled out of the air. So you really don't know. So you kind of like consider everything and then apply that to what you believe yourself.
Right? For anyone who didn't hear Annika, some are based off research, some are based off morals, some are just pulled out of thin air, and it's sort of on us to take that information and apply it to what we want to do. Yeah, Peyton. Yeah, so the quality of information varies along with the source of information. Anyone else? So what's the problem here? We might not know what's correct. Any other problems you guys foresee? Yeah, Lily P.
I don't think it's the way
All right, so one problem is we can't weight information the same. This goes back to what we were talking about with Bayesian updating, right? How valuable is new information? It depends on the source. It depends on the quality. Yeah.
It also comes back to like your personal value of the source too, because like if you're someone who's had a lot of bad experience with doctors who have just like prescribed things that only make you sicker, you might have a distrust towards the doctor, and so you might be a little bit more like leaning towards listening to a friend or someone.
Right, and our personal values come into play. That, like Lily mentioned, weighting the information isn't as important in terms of Bayesian updating for new information, but our priors, our previous beliefs, what we knew before we get new information is also important. So let's flip that question a little bit. Can the fact that there is this disagreement be good? And we can think about, maybe you distrust your doctor, but we can also think about, like, can the fact that what the American Pediatric Society says is different from what the Mayo Clinic says, can that be good? And you can think about it as good for yourself, the individual, or good for society overall. What do you guys think? Yeah, Lily.
I think there's a point where it is inherently good to kind of question everything everyone says. So like even if your doctor says something, you might be like, can you give me research to back that up? And here I contrast different data, which is what Emily stressed in that book, is that different things, different sources would say may not always be correct or the same as what in Australia or England. So just the concept of not following anything blindly.
All right, so one of the things that differing recommendations might do is lead us to not follow recommendations blindly. That's sort of cool and interesting, right? Cynthia, you had a hand.
Well, and it's always what Lily just said. I feel like it's okay to have different and conflicting recommendations and all of that, because that's the entire world. So I feel like what needs to happen is women need to have the ability to question that and find out what works for them, and not just the baseline, go this, go that, do everything. But I don't feel like right now all women have the ability to question that and make their own decisions.
Right, excellent point. And you actually get to what I wanted to talk about next, and we've been talking about it throughout the semester, right? Recommendations aren't enough. Peyton, you mentioned this earlier in class, right? Recommendations aren't enough because what we need is this baseline respect for agency. We talked about that in our very first discussion. Respect for agency. Everyone here can make choices, right? And we have to take those choices into account when we are making decisions in a data-driven world. That's what agency is. Anyone else have anything they want to add to that? Yeah, Sita.
I also think having different sources present different results about information, especially if it's from very similar studies or even the same study, can be good because then it could help to like make the biases of all the studies more visible.
Right, different sources are good. It might expose our biases. We're talking about bias next week, right? The fact that these recommendations differ might be informative. And when we're making decisions, what we want to do is get new information. So we've already said that recommendations aren't enough. And Lily P., I think this gets at something you were talking about earlier, right? It's how did they arrive at these recommendations? And that's when we get into things like, mechanisms. Perhaps those mechanisms are scientific. The placenta can't absorb anything that's not in the blood or whatever. Perhaps those mechanisms are belief-based. Perhaps those mechanisms are something else. But we want to know, how do they arrive at these recommendations? What do you guys have to say about that? All right, cool. Let's move on a little bit. So earlier we were talking, and Sita, you brought this up. When we're thinking about making decisions in a data-driven world, what ethical issues get brought up? You mentioned we can't haphazardly test on pregnant women. That's probably a good thing. What other ethical issues get brought up to all of you? Cynthia, you might talk about, just respect for agency and respect for choice as an ethical issue in and of itself. What else? Anyone have any ethical issues when it comes to pregnancy-based decisions? All right, so let's press pause for a second. Did you guys understand why Emily Oster was saying some of these studies might not be ethical? Anyone want to go over it really quick? Right. So Annika brought up the location of the studies and certainly the location of the recommendations, and that's important. But sort of pressing forward on that, what we can do in studies might be limited. And they might be limited for ethical reasons, right? So suppose it's important to science to know how COVID transfers to a fetus. That might be a really important thing to learn in science. But for better or worse, we have a system of medical ethics, bioethics in this country and other countries, but we'll talk about US-based studies, where what we're going to do is observe pregnant women who have been infected with COVID rather than infect them ourselves, rather than take a needle full of COVID and pump them in. We see these ethical issues in how we're studying vaccine efficacy right now. What would make, and we'll see this in our experimental design lectures, what would make a really compelling experiment is to take a bunch of people who had never been infected, put them away from the rest of the society, buy 2 hotels, put uninfected people in one hotel, put uninfected people in another hotel, take the second hotel, give everyone COVID, give everyone the vaccine, and see what works. That would be a really compelling study, but it's not ethical. So what do? We give people the vaccine, we give people a placebo shot, we let them live out their daily lives, and then we see who got infected ex post after the thing. And that's really good for telling us things like relative risks. Our measures of vaccine efficacy are just relative risk assessments. So when we see that AstraZeneca is 90% effective, what that means is relative to not having a shot. It doesn't mean that we brought 100 people in with COVID, gave them all the shot, and 90 people got cured. We're talking about relative risks. That's just a sort of side note from what we're talking about in class today. What are some other ethical issues you guys can foresee here? Or, alternatively, is it good that we have these ethical firewalls in place? Lily's saying yeah. Ethics isn't the only thing that can get in the way of data-driven decisions. Sometimes things aren't feasible without being unethical. So, in the chapter, Emily Oster talks about some of her other work, like television rollout in India. There's nothing unethical about giving someone a TV, inherently. But it might not be feasible to randomly assign that. So one of the things when we're doing data-driven work is to think about other ways we can get around both ethical issues, but also feasibility issues. And this is what we're talking about more in the second half of the semester when we get into the philosophy behind causality. Any thoughts or questions so far? So let's bring that back to drinking coffee, right? Because it might be unethical to shoot pregnant women up with a bunch of caffeine, but we have these studies about coffee. What are these studies telling us? Yeah, Sita.
They all tended to have differing conclusions, but basically that a little bit won't be that bad, or won't be bad. But also they don't, I'm pretty sure this is correct, but I actually talked about that they only test a large amount of caffeine being taken in, so the test of maybe a cup a day isn't done.
Right, and you raise another interesting point, which is it's not just these tests of large versus small, but when we test like that, it's hard to draw implications for cutoffs. So we know that 5 cups of coffee might be bad. We know that 1 cup of coffee might not be so bad, and I'm using very, very loose language here. But it's harder to tell the difference between 2.5 and 3 cups. This gets back to what we were talking about last week with Bayesian updating. It helps if we have some underlying theory, like caffeine is absorbed in the body linearly, or caffeine is absorbed into the body at an increasing rate, or whatever, right? It can be any sort of underlying theory, but that can help us draw a more clear decision from less feasible data. Questions so far? So when we did chapter 1 of Calling Bullshit last week, one of the things that you guys wanted to talk about, it seemed, was this concept of implication, or this concept of paltering. Who wants to refresh our memory what they were talking about there? Yeah, last week when we did chapter 1 from Bergstrom West, you guys seemed sort of intrigued by this concept of we can lie by implication, or we can lie by paltering. So who wants to remind us what that concept was? Yeah, and remind me of your name? Yeah, so there's connotation, there's implication. It might not be an outright lie, but like when 7-Up says all natural, you might be thinking one thing. You might be thinking more akin to organic when it doesn't mean anything from a legal sense. There's ways of lying. There's ways of implying without telling an outright mistruth. Did you guys notice any of that? Any sort of implicature or paltering in this chapter? Yeah, see that.
Going back to the coffee example, by saying 1 cup a day might not be that bad, it's probably okay. That leaves so much room for interpretation. You can say that so many different ways.
Right. So there was certainly one thing I noticed, right? You can say not bad so many different ways. What a lot of these recommendations said was no amount of caffeine has been proven safe. But that felt really a lot like the paltering we saw in Bergstrom West to me, because no amount of carrots have been proven safe. Emily Oster's words, right? There are some things where things are actually studied, things like Tylenol or Advil, where there's reason we might want to check on it on the fetus. But there are other things where not proven safe, first of all, is sort of a meaningless word. Remember, science is not about proof. Science is about disproof. Part of it just means there haven't been rigorous studies from which we can draw conclusions. It implies unsafe. But that's not really what the data are telling us. What do you guys think about that? All right. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about today, we can try and make it a quick day, get everyone ready for the weekend. But the other thing that really struck me from this chapter that I wanted to talk about was this concept of sort of the secret knowledge, the hidden menu. So when we read these official recommendations, they say don't drink. But when we're talking to our friends, everyone says, oh yeah, I had a glass of wine at dinner. Or I might have had, a cup of coffee at breakfast. So when we're making data-driven decisions, how do we tease apart this secret menu, this hidden knowledge that everyone seems to have in quiet conversations with their friends from these official recommendations? How do we tease those apart? And again, we can think about data-driven decisions more broadly. We don't have to be thinking about coffee during pregnancy. We can think in grander terms than that. Right? We're just using this as an example, as a lens through which we view data-driven decisions more generally. Yeah, Lily. Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of personal experiences, and it was just so very across the board to be like, oh, this was funny, and maybe this could be delayed, and this was like 10 cups a day, and it's super smart. And it just showed that personal experience usually is not a very repeatable or not valid, but not on the large scale.
Right. So the difference between these scientific studies that we're reading about in the book and also the anecdotal evidence that we see online. What else? Yeah, Sira.
Also going off of Lily's point about different people responding to different amounts of caffeine in different ways, it also talks about the fact that there are so many variables that we're not accounting for that impact the mother and child, or yes. But also that we all, everyone responds to caffeine and alcohol and tobacco differently within the body. Yes, there are things that are the same, but we all are different. So, generalized data isn't necessarily going to be applicable to everyone.
Right, and certainly that's a super interesting question. To some extent, that's going to be somewhat beyond the scope of our class, right? But this concept how when we read scientific studies, we're mostly reading about central tendency. Averages, most common numbers, middle numbers. But that leaves out a lot of really rich and really robust data where there might be a lot of overlap. Yeah, and remind me of your name?
Jackie. So going off of that, I think because of that, maybe scientists tend to overcompensate with their data, sort of.
Right, excellent point. And it sounds like you're driving us full circle a little bit, right? Because people respond to caffeine differently. People respond to alcohol differently. There are some absolutes, like alcohol is processed in the liver, but how quickly might depend on, height, weight, BMI, how much you had to eat that day, how tired you are, how quick your metabolism is. And because there's so many different variables and perhaps hidden variables, maybe when we read a recommendation, it's not going to take all that information into account. But Cynthia, what does that say about our agency, right? We should be able to make choices for ourselves. We all seem in agreement there. So really, we're getting into this sort of like ongoing cycle, big circle of what to do, how to make these decisions. I want to get back to something that Lily mentioned earlier, because one of the ways we get around that is with this concept of mechanism. And we'll see that a little bit later in the semester, right? But one thing that can help, especially when we're fighting off, the mommy wars online, is when we understand exactly how these things work. And that can mean from a biological perspective, but it can also mean from some other perspective. But when someone says, well, you wouldn't give alcohol to a 3-year-old, why would you give it to a fetus? Well, it depends, right? Because in a fetus sense, it has to go into your bloodstream first, through the liver, through the placenta. So it might not actually make it to the fetus. We need to understand the scientific mechanisms at play behind it. Again, sort of outside the scope of this class, more a Core 160 question. But when we're thinking about data, broadly speaking, we want to know the data generating process. So how does something get in the bloodstream might be an example of that. Anyone else? So let's do what we do with the other readings. What big lessons did you take away from this chapter? And by big lessons, certainly we can say something like a little bit of coffee is okay, but I don't necessarily mean about alcohol and tobacco and caffeine. I mean with data. What big data lessons did you take away? No one drew any lessons from this chapter? Yeah, Elizabeth and Peyton.
Kind of big lesson you're looking for, but one of the things that how doctors would say no alcohol when they meant a little bit, so that sometimes people can draw harder lines to making two because they don't trust the people they're recommending for.
Right, excellent point. And the big lesson that I drew when I was reading things like that was the importance of cutoff variables, right? Sita, you mentioned this earlier. What's the difference between 1 cup of coffee and 2 cups of coffee? Because when we read official recommendations, it might not say no 5 cups. But we need to understand the cutoffs there. We need to understand the difference between 5 and 4 and 4 and 3 and even 4 and 3.5. Excellent point, Elizabeth. Peyton, I think I saw a hand.
I was going to say, Allison said that we've been saying everyone is different, so you just have to look at data and kind of make the best choice for yourself. Take the data you're given and choose for yourself.
Right, excellent point. Any other big lessons you guys took away? So Peyton, let's, when you're talking about you have to look at the data, in part because everyone is affected differently by these, let's call them treatments. One of the things that struck me here was the importance of hidden variables. See, to use your point, it's not just how much coffee you drank, but how much you weigh when you're drinking coffee. It's not just how many drinks per day you have, but the speed with which you drink them. The 2 big lessons I took away from this chapter were cutoff variables and hidden variables. And I think that's going to really come into play next week when we talk about bias and start to think about how these variables are getting to us in the first place. So it's Friday, it's still super early. I think we can call it early for the day. But anyone have any final comments before I close my laptop? Great. Well, you all did really great today. I know this was a really reading-heavy week. Now that we have a bunch of this sort of baseline information out of the way, our semester will start to balance out some. Anyone with any requests for student hours or need me to sign anything, come here, send it to me over email, and have a great weekend, everyone.